This week on Poll Hub, from election security to the war in Iran, we're unpacking the latest NPR PBS News Marist poll numbers. And boys, there are a lot to talk about. Then it's time to be perfectly imperfect. We're talking about perfectionism and its far-reaching effects. And finally, are you feeling the effects of the clock change? You're not alone. That's our topic in this week's Fun Fact. This is Poll Hub. Let's get started. And hi, everyone. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm Mary Griffith.
I'm Barbara Carvalho.
I'm Tommy Rogers.
And I'm Lee Maringoff.
Well, in case anyone has forgotten, this is, in fact, an election year. The midterm elections are still more than 7 months away, but every election cycle, it seems that there are questions about election security, the potential for fraud and other misdoings. And that was a prominent topic in our new national survey with NPR and PBS News. So let's jump in. When it comes to confidence in fair and accurate elections, 66% of Americans say they're either very confident or confident that their state or local government will run a fair and accurate election come November. But that's actually down from 76% in 2024. More than 6 in 10, 63% express confidence that ballots will be counted accurately. And 33% of adults believe that the biggest threat to safe and secure elections is voter fraud. And that's followed by misleading information with 26%. And voter suppression with 24%. Of course, there are partisan differences on these questions. But Lee, I want to come back to the confidence in accurate elections. What do you think accounts for the decline in over the past 2 years?
Well, I think that there's very little in the way of defending accuracy. We're hearing an awful lot, obviously, from the Trump administration and the notion that things have been rigged and all that. I mean, I think generally that creates a atmosphere that casts a dim light on the accuracy. But what I think is interesting about that, which on this particular question, when you introduce the element of state and local governments, that becomes less of a partisan affair, where you have on this question, 68% of the Democrats and 67% of the Republicans think it's going to be counted accurately. Independents a little less, but not enormously. So the whole thing is shifted downward, but it's not separated as much by partisanship as a lot of other questions that we're going to talk about, where Democrats are going one way and the Republicans are going the other way. That's not the case in this one.
Well, I think one of the concerns is that elections are table stakes for democracies. When we've talked a lot, on this podcast about trust in institutions. And if people don't have trust in the election process, and we can point to many faux democracies, around the world where there are elections that are predetermined, that really undermines the whole credibility of the social and democratic system. So I think what has occurred, not just in the last couple of years, but probably, if we think about the last decade or so, elections have actually become a campaign talking point, which is very different than perhaps some of the shenanigans that may have happened in the past. So, we can often point to areas and local races, where the opposing parties, candidates, supporters were given fewer voting booths, causing, long lines. They were given the voting booths that probably, didn't work as well as in other places. And so there were kind of these local ways of perhaps making it a little bit more effort for someone to participate than your supporters. But now it's very, very different. And both sides, both Democrats and Republicans, have used voting and participation as a campaign talking point. So Republicans, and we'll see this in, many of the other questions that I know you want to point out, Mary, that, Republicans truly believe that there is a great deal of voter fraud. Those are the messages that they are getting. That's the media exposure that they have, despite the fact that there has been study after study and court case after court case, which has proven that that is not the case. And Democrats believe that there is an enormous amount of voter suppression, that voters are kept away from voting locations, and that they are targeted, particularly in Democratic areas. And again, there is little support up until this point for those conclusions. So I think it's dangerous for our election process, and certainly something that's not going away as we get closer and closer to November.
Go back to 2000, the famous Florida case in the Bush-Gore election, and it went all the way to Thanksgiving as they were hanging chads and all that, those kinds of...
And the Supreme Court.
And it ends up a 5-4 decision of the Supreme Court. But what does Al Gore do as the losing candidate at the end of that? He concedes defeat. Fast forward to the 2020 election, and well, that's a very different picture in terms of what Donald Trump did and not actually showing up at the inauguration, eliminating the peaceful transfer of power and the concession. And that provides legitimacy to the process. If you lose and you concede, that makes a big difference. I know we have other questions, Mary.
We do. I also just wanted to make one point. Barbie made a really good point about this as election security being a talking point for campaigns. And I'm wondering here, how much of the confidence in elections do Americans have based on who is in power in the White House or who is the dominant party in Congress? So I'm wondering, if perhaps we're seeing the shift in opinion among Democrats or Republicans based on who has control of Congress, who is in power in the White House. We also asked about the possibility or the likelihood that voters will be turned away at the polls. And here we see that nearly 6 in 10 Americans think it is at least somewhat likely that people will show up at the polls and be told that they are not eligible to vote. 42% don't believe that that's likely or likely at all to occur. But we did ask, and this is something that's interesting, we did pit the two against each other here to see what Americans are more concerned about, whether they're more concerned with ensuring that everyone who wants to vote can do so, or if they're more concerned about voters who are ineligible to vote will actually vote. And here we found that 59% of Americans are more concerned with people who want to vote can do so, and 41% are concerned that ineligible voters will actually vote. So what is this, when we look at this in terms of what's more important to Americans and to the population, what does this mean?
It means Democrats and Republicans see this entirely differently. So on the question of whether there's going to be fraud or not, yeah, it's 50-50 in the aggregate, but Republicans are at 70% thinking there will be fraud. Democrats at 32%. Now, that's a big number to say there's going to be fraud in the election, but the difference is enormous. The gap on the other questions, the same thing. People will show up and told they're not eligible to vote, that they won't. Well, the Democrats think 74% think that's going to happen. Only 47% of Republicans. And so you go question by question on this. And what the problem is a very different view of elections, depending on whether you're Democrat or Republican. And the independents, I think, in some ways haven't really weighed in on this. They're in the middle where you expect to find them. But, on some questions, the independents are closer to the Democrats, and other questions are closer to the Republicans. I think there's still a group that's yet to be heard from. But the bottom line gets back to what Barbara's saying. I mean, we're talking about the greatest democracy in the world, and we're talking about whether the election's going to be, everybody's going to be counted, everybody who's eligible can vote, there's going to be no fraud. I mean, these are kinds of things that, the civics textbooks, have to be rewritten to include the doubts about people have about the electoral process, as fundamental as that. And we did have, look, we've had instances of, City Hall and the machines, and they were thought to be corrupt. And, you go back to the Kennedy-Nixon election, 1960, and there's a sense that, well, maybe that one, kind of like Illinois, Mayor Daley at the time may have tossed a few extra in for Kennedy to carry Illinois, but it's not as pervasive as what we're talking about now. And I think that's really the underlying point.
And I think a lot of the rules have changed as well. I mean, we have decades of changes in registration in some states and enrollment in particular parties that really have minimized the possibility that there will be fraud at the local level, as we had seen probably in the middle of the previous century. But until both parties feel that this is not to their benefit to use as a campaign issue, I think we're going to be continuing to see a lot of misinformation about this.
And Barb, you are our resident AI expert here at the Marist poll, and we did ask about concern about AI, the role that AI will play in spreading misinformation about elections. And here we found that 85% of Americans think that it's either very likely or likely that political content created by AI or artificial intelligence will spread that type of misleading information. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, buyer beware. And we often have this conversation too with our students about, well, what is a credible source? And unfortunately, we don't have an agreement on what a credible source is. And so, to the degree that the source that someone depends upon does not necessarily have the journalistic ethics that we have been used to in previous decades, you're seeing already a lot more content based on AI rather than reporters. And for those who have political stakes, in this, you're going to see a lot more. So yeah, more than ever, AI is the kind of the Wild West. And I think we're going to be seeing a lot of this.
Yeah, and on that particular question, there's no partisan difference either of any great note. Republicans, Democrats, and Independents are all in the 80s on that. So this is it's become a cottage industry, and some of it's entertaining. Even you see weird things that are supposed to be funny, but then you get to things and you just don't know whether they're real or not, and you can't tell, and that really is a huge disservice.
So I would be very remiss if we didn't discuss some questions that we released actually late last week from the same survey with NPR and PBS News on Iran and the conflict in Iran. And what we found here is that 56% of Americans oppose or strongly oppose U.S. military action in Iran. Not surprisingly, most Democrats, 86%, and more than 6 in 10 independents express opposition to military action in the region. Most Republicans either strongly support or support American involvement there. We did also take a look at the level of threat that Iran poses to U.S. national security. And here we found that 8 in 10 Americans do perceive Iran as a threat. However, 44% perceive the nation to be a major threat. And an additional 40% reported that it is a minor threat to U.S. national security. And now, compared with just after the June 2025 U.S. airstrikes in Iran, slightly fewer Americans now say Iran poses a grave threat to the United States. Lee, this obviously is an election year. This is certainly a major conflict, and wars, without a doubt, drive the conversation going into elections. Where do you think this early on, with more than half a year out before the midterm elections, the impact will have on voters?
Yeah, the impact is if we're having this discussion in September and October, and we're talking about, bombing, not bombing, boots on the ground. This is, the bottom line. Democrats are going to point out that this is this is not what Donald Trump said he was going to do. This is not the Donald Trump people voted for. And yet, in a lot of places, we seem to be getting entangled in international affairs. And what happens in the case of Iran is you're going to see it, and you already are, when you fill up your gas tank. And that process is one that connects the international and the economic, just like the tariffs did as well. And for Donald Trump, that's why his approval rating is kind of like locked in. But when it comes to specific policy areas, he's actually doing worse. So on the economy, immigration, when people start evaluating him that way, the numbers are actually worse than his overall performance. So this becomes a political situation to the degree that it lingers. And if it lingers or another front is opened up, then all of a sudden you start saying, well, there's problems in Ukraine, there's problems in Venezuela, they're talking maybe Cuba. Now, we have Iran. All of a sudden it looks like there's a lot of hot spots in the world. And that changes the dynamic going into the midterms to a significant degree if all this stuff is still going on.
Perfectionism. That's actually often a conversation here at the Marist poll, for good or bad. But research from the American Psychological Association shows that perfectionism is not only common, but also increasing and across generations, particularly among young people. I mean, we do see a lot of issues among young people, particularly with regard to anxiety. Psychologists identify 3 types of perfectionism: self-oriented, in other words, you put a lot of pressure on yourself; other-oriented, which means you put a lot of pressure on others, something, I have been accused of; and socially prescribed, meaning that we feel those pressures from, peers or other people. And the fastest occurring is actually the socially prescribed perfectionism, or the feeling that others, demand perfectionism from you. And of course, the prime suspect of that pressure is parents. A number of studies have shown that young people do feel a good deal of pressure to meet the expectations of their parents. I don't think that that is something that is unusual or different. I think the proportions of people that are feeling this socially prescribed perfectionism, particularly from parents, is up considerably. Parenting pressure, their expectations and criticisms, are linked to an increase, particularly in perfectionism among college students. And the American Psychological Association does point to some mental health consequences of this, including depression, anxiety, and even eating disorders. When we look at adults between 16 and 25 years old, we do find that about 25 to 30%, I should say, of adolescents say that they are impacted by perfectionism, and that is a very, very large proportion. Between those ages 16 to 25, one international study found that 85% reported that they felt that they had perfectionist traits, especially related to academics. So I find this really interesting. And I think, in the past, and one of the changes that I've observed in looking at this issue is we often thought of perfectionism kind of as a personality trait. It was something that was, part of the individual. And so the idea that society prescribed perfectionism seems to be much more endemic. What do you think is driving this trend?
I would say competition taken to the extreme, the opportunity to succeed, and this either the self pressure on that or the familiar pressure, but also the cultural pressure, the wider society. What do we value? A shiny new car, a big house, a success in terms of monetary and materialistic things. And if you have those, then you're somehow a good person. And if you don't, then you're behind the eight ball. And I think competition taken to the extreme can become the serious kinds of problems of anxiety and depression, eating disorders, particularly if you come up short or you think that you've failed to meet, let's say, your parents' expectations. Even though those may not be realistic, there's still a huge influence on people growing up.
Well, a lot of what we try to teach students in our classes and certainly in our research here at the Maris Poll is that failure is actually a good thing. So, Mary, how do you feel that this fear of failure has gotten to such a point that it has caused really mental health problems for many people?
So, for full disclosure, you might not think of me as a perfectionist based on this podcast, but I do consider myself a perfectionist. And in terms of the fear of failure, I think it does come back to the expectations placed on individuals, whether it be by their family or in the workplace. But I think that there's this idea of if things aren't perfect, you will not get ahead. And if you don't get ahead, what does that mean for your future?
Yep.
And so I agree with you, Barb. I think that we do learn from our failures or from our mistakes. I hate the word failure, but I am a fan of mistakes and using the term mistakes. And I think that we do learn from our mistakes. It's something that I, as a parent, try to instill in my children. That's a whole other conversation. Or we could talk about it in terms of the placement of the expectation of perfectionism on children. We could talk about that too. But I'm curious to bring Tommy into the discussion. What do you experience through your interactions with your peers? Do college students feel this pressure? Do they want to be perfect? Or are they rebelling against the expectation to be perfect because it's that idea that there is so much pressure, there is so much stress placed on the young person that they want to go in the opposite direction?
Well, I think for my generation, like a lot of the pressure comes from social media, and particularly like in a professional manner, I would say like our LinkedIn profiles where like we're all like posting our internships, and it can make people like feel bad because you don't have an internship right now, or someone just posts they got a new car. It's like you want to be like that, right? But for me personally, like I would say like I'm self-oriented. I don't really care what's going on with others. I just care about like what I'm doing, and I understand that like I'm not going to be perfect. Like I'm going to make mistakes. I actually almost get like excited when I make a mistake or I fail because like I knew like I tried my best. I try my best at everything I do. So yeah, I would say for my peers, just social media is the main factor that's driving this.
But Tommy, it isn't just you that has that experience with social media from a parental standpoint too. So I'm on social media and I see fellow parents or, my kids in school and everything looks perfect, right? I mean, they've got the perfectly dressed kids with the perfect hair and everybody's smiling and happy and wonderful. And I'm like, oh my God, my house is like a dumpster fire. And so, I think that there's that expectation or that's that fear of failure as a parent as well. And then, you have to check it. Because how many photos did they have to take before the kids looked perfect, before the family, was perceived to be perfect? And I can say that my photos on social media, I probably take 20 to 30 before I pick the one that's posted. Because you want your family to appear to be perfect.
So if I had children, I'm not sure whether I'd like them to succeed or just beat the other guy. In other words, well, what?
Oh, nicely. That's really great. No pressure there.
No
Okay.
pressure there, but I played a lot of baseball in my day, and the idea was winning. It wasn't someone got the runs in. That worked for me, but the team part and the individual part. But Mary, I think it's funny you said your pressure comes self-oriented, and I probably think I'm that way too. But I don't know. I think when we talk about examples, it seems we're talking cultural as setting the yardstick.
What I'm curious about is whether or not people who perceive themselves to be perfectionists, that is self-oriented pressure, how that then translates to the next generation. Because then, you have the perfectionist parent, but then now are you putting the pressure on your children to be perfectionists? Or are they just adopting that naturally?
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I find interesting is particularly with younger folks, and you can weigh in on this too, Tommy, is that the boundaries that they place around professional life and the interest and importance of having a more balanced lifestyle than perhaps their parents and or grandparents had. Is this a coping mechanism to some of the pressures that they're feeling?
I would say for most, yeah, that would be a coping mechanism. I don't know about particular for me. Like, I'm just not like the type of person. Like, I'm just always doing something, and it's always gonna be something productive. I'm not like one of those people that really like goes at whatever. So yeah, I would say that yeah, for most it's a coping mechanism, but for me particular, no.
And so when we talk about, I mean, I think it's really important that many people are feeling this. And this is across generations. We focused on younger folks because I think they do have the pressures of having to make a lot of choices and being at points in their life where those choices are going to matter, whether it's about, continuing their education or who they marry or the profession that they decide to go into or not. But this is certainly something, that exists across generations. And I just wonder, Tommy, when you talk about the fact that you have this, ability to kind of, shut these things out, what is it that you feel that, can you identify things that you do that help you create those boundaries?
You mean like particularly people like me not caring about what others think?
Yeah, because I mean that can be so common, and I think about the women's Olympic skater who won the gold medal, and you could see the joy on her face. I mean, it's not that she didn't have the discipline and the interest and the commitment to get to that level, but the ability to remove that anxiety and feel like everything was at stake. She was going to enjoy her performance, and we all enjoyed her
That's right.
performance.
That's right.
So I just wondered personally, is there something that you think about or you might suggest to others that can take away that intense anxiety or pressure to perform?
I would say that, growing up, like playing sports, playing football particularly, like I learned so much from playing sports. So like I think, for like the younger generation, playing sports is gonna be super, super important because you learned how to deal with the anxiety, right? And being in a football game, like you get the ball, it's like it's so scary. And I just kind of like think back to those times of how scared I was, right? And it's like it's okay. Like I fumbled the ball and life
Did you
went
play
on.
for the Giants at any point?
No, no, no. But yeah, I would say that's where that comes from. Just because I felt so much anxiety back then that like now everything's just like it's fine.
Well, I would say that Mary and I and others I've since learned have a unique coping mechanism. It's called nightmares. And so
Yes.
we still, and it's kind of funny to compare notes on this, but I'll speak for myself. I mean, the most common nightmare I get is something having to do with the educational system, meaning I have an exam coming up and I didn't even know I was registered in the course. I never read it, did any of the work. It's all sort of like this fear of failure in the educational system. And that's sort of where it's, I always jokingly say in class, if students are getting nightmares because of what I'm doing, I kind of feel bad. I may be ruining people's lives because I certainly carry that fear all the way through adulthood. Mary, you're still a similar thing.
Yes, 100%. I've had that fear that I've gotten locked out of my locker in high school, and then my schedule was in there, and I couldn't get there, and the bells are ringing, and then I'm trying to figure out what class I had next. I've had the nightmare where we're at the end of my senior year in college, and I realized that I didn't take a course, or that I was registered for a course, and I only went to it once, thinking that it was only like a one-time, course. It was so bizarre, but yes, I've had those. And that is something that I will say I've taken a step back with my kids, although you probably don't believe me, where I've reached the point where I've seen them start now to be like, everything is academic, everything is, school with you. And they're starting to push back a little bit more. And so I've taken the step back and I've said, okay, it's on you. You guys want to do this? You do it. If not, that's your call, and everything will be just fine at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think that if you are sensing that you may have this tendency towards perfectionism, there are a couple of hints. One is if you are also a procrastinator, this can be a result also of thinking that you do need to be perfect. And another is experiencing burnout because it's tough. It's really tough to try to be perfect all the time. And I think your thoughts, Mary, about mistakes is good advice. We all make them. Hopefully, we all learn from them and have a little bit more of an inward understanding and be a little kinder to ourselves.
At the risk of getting a groan from my colleagues, I'm now going to enter into a timely fun fact. And what does it do? Why the groan? Because we just moved our clocks back and we have an idea.
No, we moved our clocks forward,
Well,
Lee.
see, now that's why I'm late for everything. I can never get that straight. But the question being then, as I'm looking at it from the Ipsos poll of 2021, when clocks move forward 1 hour in the spring, does any of the following happen? Like, does it improve do you get better sleep, worse sleep, no change in your sleeping patterns? So what is going on with this 1 hour change that does have such an impact on people? I mean, I think most people get tired. They say, it's like worse than, when the jet lag. I mean, it seems that you can recover better from 3 hours of that than you can from 1 hour. But how does your sleep go? I'm gonna start off with AJ here, and we're gonna find out. AJ, you turn the clocks forward 1 hour. How's your sleeping going?
Okay, well, at first, obviously, you lose sleep, right? Because you lose an hour. But I think overall, there's a benefit, at least for me. I feel like I've been sleeping a little bit better than I usually do, I would say.
Okay. I'm going to give the national numbers in a second. Tommy, snoring away a little longer than you normally
No,
do?
this might be what was wrong, but like I could not sleep last night. I didn't go to bed till like 4 a.m. It was bad, but I don't know if that's what it was or just tired from the weekend or
You wanted the
something.
podcast to be perfect. You were
Yeah.
stressed. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I think is really interesting is I do need to travel on a couple of highways to get to Marist. And the day before we changed the clocks forward, there were, Department of Transportation flashing signs to stay awake, stay alive. If you're drowsy, pull over. So I think there is something to the fact that we get a bit off balance. And I think losing the hour tends to be a little bit more difficult than when we get the hour back. later in the year. I do agree with AJ. I think there is also a lot of benefit to it. I love the extra light in the afternoon, given that I mostly get up in the dark anyway. It didn't really change all that much. And the fun thing about the moving the clocks forward is that the dogs and the horses are really excited that they get fed an hour earlier.
Do they know? Do they know?
Well, they know in the fall because it's a much more difficult thing to have them expect to get their dinner or their breakfast an hour later. Particularly the horses are on a very strict timetable. And if you've ever seen a meme of a horse owner bemoaning the fact that they're getting hassled and the horses are complaining. Usually that happens within 2 minutes of their expected time of eating. So an hour is probably thought of as a lifetime.
So, Mary, that's a tough segue to you. So, following horses and dogs, how's your sleeping going?
I really haven't seen too much difference. I mean, like Barb, I get up very early. And so the darkness in the morning is not different. I do feel off though during the day because I feel as though I'm doing something that it should be an hour behind. And because of the light and the changes. And so Sunday was a very difficult day. So I certainly feel off balance. And just come to my house and try to get my tween boys up in the morning, and you can tell how much I love this time of year. But we're all off balance.
The national numbers, though, were surprising to me because people said 13% said it improves a better sleep, 14% said worse, but 72% said no change.
Wow. Yeah.
I think there is a change. I don't know if it's improving or hurting our sleep, but I'm in the night owl category, so I go to sleep very late, and it does affect the morning then and the rest of that day. And it takes, I think, a day to recover, or two or three or a week. Anyway, that wraps it for this week. Have a good night's sleep tonight. Don't worry about your exams and anything else that we may have touched upon on this particular podcast. We'll catch up with you next week.
That'll do it for Poll Hub this week. Poll Hub is produced by the Marist Poll at Marist University in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer.
Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes AJ Gambino, Tommy Rogers,
Cassie Connors, Sylvia Weiser, and Molly Goodger.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, consider telling a friend about us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal accessible from our website.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub, and with any luck, it'll cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button.
Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcasting app as soon as it's released.
We'll see you next time.